Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Wendy, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out here. I see I'm going to have to shout here today, and well, the big problem with immigrants is that they have funny accents and nobody can understand them. And even my 5 children, I have 5 American children, but none of them can really imitate me. They make me sound like Daddy Pig. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, my wife lives in the back and will indicate, but you can raise a fiery cross or some other cultural symbol, and I will do my best to assimilate culturally. So I'm going to say three things today. The first is I'll briefly discuss who I am, because nobody knows who I am. And then second, I'll go on to discuss what was actually the subtitle of my book, Alien Nation. It was Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster. Common Sense, of course, was a homage to Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense was, he was also an English immigrant, was instrumental in fueling the American Revolution. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is what happens next. So, who I am. I'm an identical twin. I was born in Britain in 1947. That was the year that India became independent. So that has meant that throughout my youth, Britain was on constant geopolitical retreat, giving up one colony after another. And you know, losing is a very bad habit. And one of the reasons I like President Trump is I actually like him talking about annexing Greenland and annexing Canada and wherever else he's thinking about annexing possibly Cuba. No, I don't want Cuba. Because it reverses this habit of defeat, which is a very serious habit to get into. My brother and I concluded all that was lost in Britain actually in 1967, when the Cold War was moving to its height. The reason was we were extremely impressed by the Six-Day War, when the Israelis crossed basically through the Arabs out and defeated the Arabs in 6 days of savage fighting. And what struck us was the utter unreality of the British political class in its discussion of this phenomenon, as opposed to the extraordinary realism that the Israelis showed. Whatever else you can say about Israel, and I think some people would like to say quite a lot about Israel, it does have a ruthless will to survive. And it applies to the immigration question. When Trump started talking about the wall in the 2016 debates, I was, gritting my teeth and clenching my fists saying, talk about Israel, talk about Israel. They'd already built a wall. It's 675 miles long. It's about 1/3 as long as the American wall on the southern border would have to be. It's triple fenced, and you've paid for it. But they obviously thought walls worked, and it did work. And the other thing, one other way in which it applies to immigration debates is when Trump was elected, and he was in the White House, and he was faced with this inundation at the southern border. According to the book the New York Times reporters wrote, he said, well, why can't we just shoot them? Well, that's against international law. Kenneth Kelly was his chief of staff. He was a former Marine general. And, well, what about shooting them in the legs? That's against international law, too. Well, I was interested in this question because I've been trying for years to find out why the Israelis don't have what the American Border Patrol calls Zerg rushes on the border. In those days, the southern border, what they used to do is all gang together in groups of like 100 and so on, and then suddenly rush the border patrol point, and it just simply couldn't control them, so a lot of them got through. They called it a Zerg rush. We had actually one of our board members and a long-time writer, Vida, is a former border patrol officer. Well, I couldn't find out how the Israelis avoided this. And then eventually a left-wing paper, Haaretz, in Israel, published an article about it, denouncing it, the left-wingers. And it turns out the Israelis do shoot them in the legs. They have a special group of snipers who were trained to shoot people, they say, in the legs. But over the course of the 18 months or so that Haaretz had records, 70 of them had bled out and died. For some reason, it's never reported in the American press. We thought that the British ruling class did not have that will. And we were right, as we see with this ridiculous situation of on the English Channel, where these dinghies are setting out into the English Channel, and the lifeboat service in Britain is picking them up and ferrying them into Britain. The Israelis would not do that. So so we decided, last time, we decided to move to America. In 1970, we both moved went to the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where in an attempt to make useless literary intellectuals into something useful. And in my brother's case, it took, and he had a long career at Wall Street. But in my case, it didn't take, and I reverted to this half-world of financial journalism. And I worked for various papers in Canada, and I worked for the Wall Street Journal and for Fortune and Barron's and Forbes in New York for a long time. And I wrote about a lot of highly technical financial issues and so on. And I moonlighted at National Review latterly. Now, in 1968, the year after, before we came to America, but the year after the Six-Day War, Enoch Powell, the Member of Parliament Enoch Powell, made his great, what's called the Rivers of Blood speech, although he didn't actually use that phrase, about immigration in Britain. He just serviced the immigration debate very suddenly after a long period of time when it had basically been repressed in respectable discussion. And that's a phenomenon I'll return to later. Of course, it meant he was anathematized. Powell was the great lost leader of British politics. He really bears very close comparison to Pat Buchanan, also a great lost leader in American politics. And Powell was interesting, especially for two reasons. When he died, I wrote that he was the greatest British politician of the 20th and the 21st century, because in the 20th century he was involved in advocating free markets at a time when socialism, statism, the government control of the economy, was absolutely dominant in the intellectual discourse. Even the Tories, the Conservatives, accepted the need for state control of things. And as you remember, Richard Nixon imposed price and wage controls in America, even though he was supposed to be a Republican president. But Powell was also a great leader, the greatest leader of the 21st century, because he pioneered the immigration issue. He died in 1998, so it was extremely prescient. He realized that the mass movement of the third world into the first world, happening for various reasons, for various reasons first evident in Britain, was the great issue that the first world in general, and the Anglosphere in particular, has to face. And he won a decisive victory against socialism. Those of you who aren't old enough to remember it, it was perhaps one of the greatest intellectual victories of all time. The economist Robert Heilbronn, who was a lifelong socialist, wrote an article in the New Yorker in 1990 admitting that the centuries-long argument between capitalism and socialism is over, capitalism has won. He didn't like it, but he admitted it with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We haven't reached that stage with the immigration debate yet, but we are working on it. Now, also in the late 60s, 1965, there was an act called an immigration act passed in America, which is generally referred to as the Hart-Celler Act, after the two people, the congressman and the senator, who sponsored it. And it kicked in 1967. Now, what that act did was it opened. You have to realise that immigration anywhere, but particularly in the US, it's not like rain. It doesn't just come and go, which is how people tend to think of it. It's a government policy. The government determines how many people come in, it determines who they are, it determines what race they are, what countries they come from, and it determines their skill levels. All of those are entirely determined by government policy. But what the Hart-Celler Act did was it opened the floodgates after a 40-year pause. when which there was almost no immigration at all. In fact, there was negative immigration in the 1940s. In 1924, there had been an act passed which dramatically reduced immigration after the great influx of immigration between the 1880s and the 1920s, which is now referred to as the first great wave. So it reduced it very dramatically, and it's also reoriented it so the immigrants coming in will have the same national origins as Americans who are already here. It wasn't going to change the ethnic balance. And it was a great success, and it was essential to assimilation. So you have this phenomenon of Italians and Americans and Germans fighting in the American army against the Italians and the Germans in the Second World War without any serious problems. And that was largely due to the 1924 cut-off. It allowed assimilation to take place. And that's one of many such pauses in American history, by the way. They're usually spontaneous, but they are frequently legislated. And those pauses are essential to assimilation. The most important was after the Revolution, when there was a period of more than 40 years when there was almost no immigration at all into the US. So the 1965 Act had... John, do you have any water?
Oh, yes.
Thanks. The 1965 Act had two key effects. First of all, it completely destabilized the racial balance of the US. In 1960, the US was 90% white. At the last survey, it was below 60% white. And that's entirely due to government policy. Thank you very much. So people talk about the Great Replacement. It's a term coined by René Camus, the French intellectual. And if you look it up on Grok or something, you'll find it's denounced as a conspiracy theory. But it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. There is a great replacement going on right across the white world, right across the Anglosphere, right across North America. The population which was here is being replaced by a new population predominantly drawn from the Third World. One of the interesting side effects of the 65 Act, by the way, is that it dramatically cut off British immigration. Immigration from Western Europe in general, but particularly from Britain. Britain went, the immigrants from Britain fell from about 40,000 a year to about 15,000 a year, just overnight, which is a big problem for us. My brother and I at Stanford, we had to go back to the underdeveloped country from which we came to help it develop because we both had Fulbright awards. The second consequence of the Act was that the US now has a much larger population and is projected to have a much larger population than it would have done if that Act hadn't been enacted. And the numbers are not small. If it was up to the US, if it was up to the previous 2024 Act, if that had not been left in place, the population in the US would have still been below 300 million. Would have still been below 300 million. What does that sign actually mean? Slow down, okay. I thought it meant to speak more quietly.
No.
This is a particularly interesting thing when you think about environmentalism. I mean, environmentalism, since the 60s, has been a really important force in American politics. But nothing degrades the environment more than importing 120 million people and paving all of Northern Virginia to accommodate 1 million H-1B Indians. Environmentalism is not just a question of ecology, of whether the environment is healthy or not. It's also an amenity issue. I think the destruction of the Northern Virginia farmlands is a really serious aesthetic crime. So the question is, where are the environmentalist groups on immigration? And the answer is they're hiding. They're hiding because about 15 years ago, there was a huge riot. The Sierra Club, for example, used to be in favor of reducing immigration, stabilizing America's population, entirely because they knew it was degrading the environment. But about 15, 20 years ago, they changed sides on the issue. And first of all, didn't talk about immigration at all, and then secondly, joined various pro-amnesty coalitions. And the reason for this was they got an enormous amount of money from a Jewish hedge fund manager who was still hung up on Ellis Island and the Russian pogroms and so on, and thought the borders had to be kept open. The monies were very large, and it just completely changed the Sierra Club mind as to what he thought about immigration. Now, to finish this section, I'm just going to quote from Senator Teddy Kennedy. He was the floor manager of the bill, and he gave a quote which is extremely famous among immigration patriots when he in his final summary of the debate. He said, "First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains substantially the same, as then about 300,000 a year. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the changes in some quarters, the bill will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country, or the most populated and deprived nations, Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think." Every one of these predictions was proved false. He was either a fool or he was a liar, but he certainly wasn't. He just simply wasn't telling the truth. And he wrapped up with this. He said, "The charges I've mentioned are highly emotional, irrational, and with little foundation in fact. They are out of the line with the obligations of responsible citizenship. They breed hate of our heritage." Now, this is very typical of the way the immigration debate has gone since then, since 1965. Basically, it's not treated like a normal debate. Opposition to immigration is seen as completely immoral. And when they say hate, which is breed hate of our heritage, which has become, of course, they're on the verge of getting this into the Constitution, banning hate speech. What they mean is criticism of immigration has to be repressed. And it was very successfully repressed. Discussion of immigration simply vanished from American public discourse, really for nearly 30 years. The changes were happening, but people weren't really aware of them. I often compare the Hart-Celler Act, the 1965 Immigration Act, to one of those mythical, I suppose they're mythical, Chinese execution swords that can cut somebody's head off and leave the head still standing on the shoulders. The only way you can tell that it's happened is some blood trickles from the mouth. Then, of course, after 30 years, America's head fell off. We immigrated to the US, and we actually immigrated to the conservative movement. The conservative movement which had nominated Barry Goldwater and ultimately elected Ronald Reagan, and which I actually do think was one of the great flowers of democracy. Of course, it subsequently degenerated into a racket, but that's how things are. And I remember talking to a Goldwater supporter at Stanford in the small conservative students group that was there. That was the badge of honour, being Frederick Goldwater in 1964. And we started talking about immigration, and he said to us, immigration is never going to be a problem in America because the country is just too big. And it's not possible to make a significant difference to the US population by any kind of influx. And we pointed out, we had a lot of experience with American immigration because we spent a lot of time in American immigration offices getting papers filled out and that kind of thing. And we knew that we were the only white people there. The influx had been completely changed. And eventually, another British immigrant published an article, I think, in Newsweek. I've been looking for it. Now AI is around, maybe I can eventually find it, in which he made exactly the same point. He said a new nation is being built in these immigration offices. It's completely different from the nation that exists right now. And our friend, our Goldwater friend, was completely shocked. He'd never thought about it at all. And that went on for a long time. After in the early 90s, I had a debate with Bob Bartley, who was then the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, an absolutely fanatical immigration enthusiast. And afterwards, the head of one of the major foundations in New York came up to me and said, "This is amazing. I'd never heard of this 1965 Immigration Act and the effect it had." This was a serious conservative intellectual who spent a lot of money giving out money to conservative intellectuals, including ultimately me, I'm happy to say. He had never even heard of the 1965 Act. In 1982, I was at Fortune magazine, and they were looking for big stories to make a splash, and I proposed that we do a story about how the 1965 Immigration Act had not had the effect that Ted Kennedy had promised. They couldn't have been more surprised if I'd hit them over the head with a wet fish. They'd never heard of this immigration issue. The New York Times had never written about it. In those days, and it's still true, but not as much as it was, the New York Times is kind of a bellwether for the establishment media. And if things don't appear in the New York Times, they just don't exist. And they never heard of the issue, so I didn't get to write my story. I did get to write a story, though, after a protracted struggle in National Review. It was a cover story, it's 14,000 words long. It's called Time to Rethink Immigration. And as John mentioned, that is often credited with kicking off the modern immigration debate. And Coulter very kindly has said that is what changed her mind on the immigration issue. Until then, she'd just gone along with the Wall Street Journal flow and assumed that immigration was good and opposition to it was racist and embarrassing, and hadn't thought about the actual practical implications of introducing such very large numbers of heterogeneous and often unskilled people. And she went on to write Adios America, of course, which is credited with giving Trump the idea to start talking about this in 2016. But but typical of the way the immigration debate was working then, both I and my chief lieutenant on VDare.com read Anne's book and critiqued it. And then she called us up and said she was very sorry, but on the advice of other friends, she wasn't going to be able to credit us in the acknowledgements because she would just be attacked for it, and people would say that she had what they call tainted sources. And so she didn't credit us. But she felt badly about it, and she did credit me in subsequent issues of it. But that was typical of the reign of terror that was going on there, keeping the immigration debate out of public awareness. A lot of people think Anne is a bimbo, you know, but that book is extremely serious. I'm an expert in immigration books, and she is very rigorous the way she went into the law and the facts behind it. And it's actually very funny, of course, being Anne. So anyway, my National Review cover story was ultimately flowed into a book which was published in '95, which John mentioned. It's called Alien Nation, and the subtitle is Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster. Now, I didn't like the title. One of the things about working with commercial publishers is that their great moment of creative thrill is to force an author to accept a title he doesn't like and impose their own title on him. That's happened to me several times. I wrote a book about Canadian politics, which they insist on calling The Patriot Game. Of course, right at that time, Tom Clancy's novel came out, The Patriot Game. And sitting with Alien Nation, there's apparently a science fiction series called Alien Nation, which everybody confused it with. I wanted to call the book Electing a New People. That's after the famous poem by Bertolt Brecht, German poet, which he wrote after the '53 rising against the communist government in East Germany. And he said, the government should dissolve the people and elect a new one. And that's literally what America's doing. The American government is doing, dissolving the people and electing a new one. But it is, I've gotten to like the title more. It's really irritating because when you're on the road, in those days with commercial publishers, you did very long book tours, addressing dozens of audiences like this. And you have to keep mentioning the name of the book, and if you don't like it, it really gets on your nerves. But I eventually come to like it because it does make a point. The term nation is derived from the Latin nascere, and it means birth. So what it implies is that there's an ethnic link, a link by blood, a community that's linked ultimately by blood. Of course, nations are not simply linked by blood. They're ethno-cultural entities. There are some people there who've just assimilated the nation who don't necessarily share common heritage. But fundamentally, there is a need for a common heritage, a common ethnic heritage. And this is what Lincoln drew on in his first inaugural address when he was trying to persuade the South not to secede. And he said that he referred to the mystic cords of memory stretching back through water to every patriot grave, he means Revolutionary War graves, and that if they were struck, they would produce harmony. Now, of course, the South and the North did share those mystic cords of memory. They both fought in the Revolutionary War, not all on the American side, I may say, but they did have that in common. In contrast, for example, Norman Podhoretz, the great editor of Commentary magazine, once wrote that his family, of course, all arrived in the 1880s and 1890s when the great Russian Jewish immigration came in from Russia. He said to him, the Civil War was as remote of the Wars of the Wars of the Roses, and that does affect the way in which people view their fellow Americans if they don't share that in common. In any case, from about 92 to 97, we had a civil war within the Conservative movement, where National Review and his editor, John O'Sullivan, and I were arguing with the Wall Street Journal and everybody else in the Conservative movement about whether or not they should talk about immigration. And we lost this war. And Bill Buckley purged the magazine of immigration patriots. And for a while, there was nowhere to get the facts and analyses about immigration out. So I founded vdare.com. Actually, on Christmas Eve of 1999, we started publishing to it. And we went along very happily, a lot of hard work, much of it by my wife Lydia, who reformed our back end and fundraising procedures until 2022, when we were mugged by Letitia James, which is the New York State Attorney General, which is a very unpleasant black woman. This is a distinction we share, of course, with President Trump and the NRA. She actually prosecuted them on fantastic theories which would never have stood up in a normal court of law. And we had to close. We couldn't finance this lawfare, and we had to suspend VDARE in 2024. But in the interim, I should say that we made a discovery after Trump's election that what was going on in America was, and I'll discuss this at some point a bit more later, was really a slow-motion communist coup, and points of view were simply being suppressed. And we found that we couldn't hold conferences. Lydia made somewhere between 10 and 15 bookings to hold conferences in hotels, and between 2016 and 2019. And what would happen is that we would say, well, this is a controversial conference, and you might get demonstrators. And the hotels, which were all run by Americans who thought they lived in a free country, would say, no, 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 we're not afraid of controversial conferences. We've had many controversial conferences. We had a Right to Life conference once. Of course, this is nothing compared to, but they all folded. They all folded as soon as they came under pressure, and as soon as the SPLC started, Southern Poverty Law Center started contacting local organising angry phone calls to the management, and they all folded. Usually under pressure from all these hotels are owned by big corporations, and corporations are complete cowards, and they run away from everything. And they did this even though Lydia had very cleverly got them to sign a liquidated damages clause. You know, normally when you sign a booking with a hotel, they'll say you have to undertake to pay them money if you cancel. And she would say she would do that, but you have to sign it on our behalf too, to protect us. And they would say, oh, we're not going to cancel, we're not. But they did cancel, and they had to pay us substantial sums of money. In the case of New York Hilton, I think it was over $100,000, just because they didn't want to face protests and local politicians denouncing them. So we had the castle, And it's spun off as it's in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, which is in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. It's only 2 hours from the U.S. Capitol if you want to organise a stage an insurrection, as many of the inhabitants of our town did. West Virginia, Trump carried Morgan County by 52 points in 2024. It's an overwhelmingly Republican state, although very poor. We've made it. We still hope to resume having conferences there at least, and we've made it available for distant organisations, any organisation actually, but particularly distant organisations that can't find venues or don't want to take the risk of having a conference that might be cancelled. Maybe you should come here sometime too. Come to Berkeley Springs Castle sometime, John. And it's also open for weddings and other things. And if any of you want to have a wedding in a folk castle in the spa town in West Virginia, please speak to Lydia at the back. She has a card and everything. You know, when I was at Forbes, and I was at Forbes for 16 years. How many have heard of Paul Craig Roberts? Great. Well, that's great. He was he had been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He was an academic. He was a leader in developing the supply side tax policy of Reagan. But in the late 1980s, he broke from the conservative movement because he wrote a book called The Tyranny of Good Intentions, How Prosecutors and Bureaucrats Are Trampling the Constitution in the Name of Justice. And this was a real breakthrough for the conservative movement because the war against crime and the need to toughen up on judges and so on had been a major part of the conservative movement's rise to power in the 70s and 80s. They just didn't want to think about the idea that they may actually overshot in the war against crime. And so they wouldn't review him. And Craig, who I'd known since I was at Stanford, got so mad about this that he called up Steve Forbes. And Steve Forbes, the Forbes family very rarely intervened in the Forbes magazine. They left that to the editor. They were only interested in selling advertising. But Steve called the editor of Forbes, Jim Michaels, and said, basically, get somebody to review this book. So I went down to Florida. He was then living in the Florida Panhandle. And of course, as usual with journalists, I didn't think or read or do anything about the story until I was actually on the plane flying down there. When I got the book, I had the book, and I opened it and started to read it. And I was blown away by it. It was a revelation. The changes that were made during the war on drugs, the free hand it gave to prosecutors in various ways, really has caused an enormous amount of injustice in the US. In the first instance, probably to black drug dealers who may or may not have deserved it, but were not necessarily got in a legal way, a constitutional way. But also, right across the board, prosecutors got in the habit of nailing anybody they don't like, principally by the mechanism of just piling costs on them, forcing them to surrender. Craig said to me, they can put anybody they want in prison. There's no defence, what he called the rights of Englishmen. There's no defence against what these empowered prosecutors can now do. And that, of course, has turned out to be the case with this wave of lawfare that we've seen since Trump was elected. It's quite surprising how many Trump adjacent people are fighting for their lives, financial lives, at the moment, or have actually been through hell already. Like General Flynn, for example, is the first national security advisor, was forced to sell his house and because of this protracted prosecution that went on against him, to eventually was pardoned when Trump came back into power. Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, who's supposed to be America's mayor, you know, because he was there at the time 9/11, is still facing absolutely ruinous investigation in Arizona, which is in trial right now. And of course, it's this lawfare that forced us to suspend the website. We spent somewhere between $1 and $2 million defending ourselves against this quote-unquote investigation where they want thousands of documents and so on, even before we've been charged. This lawfare is not a joke. I should say, by the way, that we were charged finally, the foundation and I, and the family, which Lydia and I were charged last September. But we're not charged with misappropriating funds. We're just charged with trivial paperwork violations, which we don't think we made, but it's the kind of thing that would normally be settled by a phone call and refiling and so on. No middle-class family can stand up to this kind of thing, and we're probably going to be forced into personal bankruptcy. So my 3 daughters with Lydia are not going to the Ivy League. But we didn't want to go to Ivy League anyway. I would worry about their mental well-being there. I'm going to conclude this very quickly by saying we actually have a video that was taken by at an Anti-Defamation League conference, which the guy, the ADL henchman, who's the New York Attorney General henchman, who is leading the charge against us, his name is Rick Sawyer, gave a speech to a conference called Taking Hate to Court. And he said that hate speech, this is on video, he said it is protected by the First Amendment. But he said, there's a way around that. You can simply subpoena, the Attorney Generals have enormous subpoena power, and you can simply subpoena the purveyors of hate, namely us, to death. In other words, he made an explicit statement of his desire to get around the First Amendment. We've been absolutely unable to get the court to pay attention to this. And that speaks to the collapse of law in the US, which is partly, not entirely, but very much partly caused by the tremendous ethnic changes that have gone on in the US. For example, in our trek to New York State court system, we haven't met one white Gentile judge. And this is particularly disturbing because there's a ton of technical evidence that the concept of an objective law is really something only whites believe in. No other race apart from whites will poll the same, that if they're faced with a preferred policy outcome and the letter of the law, they would rule for the letter of the law. They just rule for what they want politically. Thus, as I say, this is a uniquely white thing. It only worked when we had an overwhelmingly white nation. So I'll now move on to my second section, which is what's happened, America's immigration disaster. You have to realize what America was in 1790, after the Revolutionary War. The census in that year reported that the white part of the nation, about 20% of it were black slaves, but they were not part of the political nation. If you looked at the white part of the population, it was 60% English, 80% British. The rest were Germans and Dutch and so on. And that made a big impression on them at the time, by the way. I mean, you often found Americans rhapsodizing about how Crève Coeur, the French intellectual, said that, what is the American, this new man, created from all parts of Europe? There were trace elements of all parts of at least Western Europe, but overwhelmingly it was a British nation, a white nation. The 1790 Citizenship Act actually said that only free white persons could become citizens, and that was only rescinded in 1952, so which is well within living memory, well, fairly well within living memory. I remember 1952. So that's how Americans saw themselves. They saw themselves fundamentally as a nation state, a white nation state. And this was represented in this famous among immigration papers, this famous quote from John Jay in the Second Federalist Papers, trying to explain to his countrymen why a federal system could work in the US. He said, of this vast area, and that was even before trains. I mean, the amount of time it took, it's quite extraordinary what they're able to do when you think every single letter and so on had to be carried by horse from one end of the country to another. And yet they're still able to build a vibrant debate in an area the size of Western Europe. Jay said, Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion. And he didn't mean Christianity, he meant Protestantism. The country was 98% Protestants at that point. Attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint councils, arms and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. I remember being at a National Review conference in the mid-90s, and we were discussing immigration, and Bork thought my answer to a question had not been satisfactory. Do you know everybody know who Robert Bork was? This is the problem with going old, you know, people things that you remember very clearly, the younger generations don't know anything about. He was a very distinguished law professor, and he was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1987 after Reagan lost control of the Senate, after the Republicans lost control of the Senate. And they had saved him. I knew the people in Reagan's judge-picking operation. They saved him because his credentials were so stellar that they just assumed nobody could seriously oppose him. But in fact, of course, Ted Kennedy made all kinds of fantastic reasons to oppose him. Like he watched the wrong movies from Blockbuster. Do people remember Blockbuster? He watched inappropriate movies, or he did ordered inappropriate movies from Blockbuster. And they succeeded in stampeding the Democrats and the various Rhino Republicans to turn him down. It was really the first sign, really the first major sign, that the concept of objective law in the US was collapsing. That that the only thing that mattered was which way would people rule on certain cases, on political grounds. Anyway, Bork gets up and didn't like my answer, so he gave a better answer, and he quoted this passage from John Jay. And he said, this is a big problem because it means the way America's been held together in the past is not just by agreeing on common principles, but because they were a common people. And we are now headed to a state which no longer possesses a common people, united in these various ways, and we don't know if it's going to work. So what that means is that even at the height of the conservative intellectual world, there were people who had already had doubts about immigration. They just weren't vocalizing it. You know, what they were under the swear was the sort of reinvention of America that went on really after this first great wave of immigration, very largely by Jewish intellectuals. And they invented this concept of melting pot. But that, you know, only came into popular parlance in 1908. It's not something that Americans have been aware of and conjuring with since the Republic was founded. So the result of that, I should say, so now by 1965, before the Immigration Act kicked in, you had got a white nation which was reasonably coherent and which had substantially assimilated each other, and there was a lot of intermarriage between the various ethnic factions there. But there was still serious sectionalism among white Americans. Lydia says I have to make clear that this is S-C-T-I-O-N and not S-E-X anything. It's not sectionalism, it's sectionalism. There were these, because my pronunciation is so terrible, there were these deep divisions within the white community, which existed quite apart from anything else that was going on. And that actually it can be traced back to different immigration patterns. There's a famous book by a Brandeis historian called David Hackett Fisher. Does anybody know anything about this? Well, it came out 30 years ago. He traced cultural patterns in the US to different immigration from different parts of the British Isles, which have significant differences. The most prominent one, for example, being the Puritans, who all came from East Anglia, the eastern part of it, and have a completely distinct ways of life to the Southerners, who come mainly from the West Country, and were Anglicans and not Puritans. And of course, then there's also the Scotch-Irish from Ulster, who emigrated to Appalachia and form a separate. He calls them borderlanders. Form a separate group. And they're all relatively distinct, although they all speak English and they're all white. Now, one example that I have, what struck me about this is my wife, Lydia, is a Texan. And when she married me, she had to move to northern Connecticut, New England, because I was living there with my 2 children from my first wife who died, and we didn't want to move them. So she was moved from Texas, from living in Texas to Connecticut. And she never really settled because fundamentally Southerners and Yankees don't like each other. This is a very deep division that goes far beyond. The Civil War was to do with a lot more to do than slavery. There are divisions within these divisions within the white community. So when my eldest daughter, with my first wife, was going to go to university, we manoeuvred her to go into Southern Methodist University in Dallas, because that's where Lydia's parents lived, and we wanted to move down there in search of free babysitting. Lydia and I have 3 children. So Lydia sat Hannah Claire down and said to her, when you're on the campus there, you will meet people and have brief conversations with them. And they will then think that they're your friend, and you're their friend, and they will do things for you. And they will expect you to think that you're their friend and you should do things for them. In Connecticut, it doesn't work that way. When Lydia was putting together Hannah Claire's high school graduation party, she said, well, who are you going to invite? What about so-and-so? Hannah Claire says, who of course spent her entire, had up to that point lived entirely in New England, said, well, she's not really a friend. What do you mean she's not really a friend? She's been in the house so many times, and this girl had been in the house many times, but she hadn't crossed the threshold which in Connecticut is regarded as being a friend. Now, in defense of the Yankees, they're not vicious. I realized this when I used to have, at one stage I was a weekender, and I used to have cars repaired and so on, maintained in New York City. And then I started having them maintained in Connecticut. And I thought that the car mechanics in Connecticut were hostile because they never spoke. They were very monosyllabic. And then one day one of them said to me, this car has such a thing that's gone wrong with it. And we can fix it, but it'll cost $400. But you should go back to the dealer because there's probably a recall on this, and then you could get it done for nothing. In other words, he was turning away business. And I realized he wasn't hostile at all. He just didn't speak very much. He was friendly. He just didn't talk very much. But these things do cause friction within the white community, and that's why we have a federal system in the U.S. so that these different types of people can govern themselves as much as possible. One of the very serious negative developments in the U.S. politics at the moment is the attempt to overwhelm, is to concentrate the government in the hands of Washington. Well, anyway, these sectional divisions have been enormously exacerbated by post-1965 immigration. One example of that is California, of course. California was the heartland of the American conservative movement. It's where Reagan came from. It's what nominated Goldwater. But now it's thought to be completely inaccessible to the Republican Party. It's totally controlled by Democrats, a one-party state, basically because of immigration. There's something like about the number of illegal immigrants in California is something like 10% of the population. It's very substantial. And they, of course, all have anchor babies. And then, of course, there's legal immigration to California. So whites in California now are driven, I think it's less than 30%, somewhere around 30% of the population is white. But I have to say, though, that the voting age population is much more wide than that. One of the characteristics of the Republican Party is that it's totally afraid to appeal to its own base. The Republican Party in California has never run on opposing immigration. Even Proposition 187, which was trying to withdraw state welfare subsidies, transfer payments from illegal immigrants, and was ultimately sabotaged by a judge, was overwhelmingly passed and ultimately sabotaged by a judge. The Republican Party ran away from it. It was passed by a pure grassroots movement, and it was never taken up by the Republican Party. And the result of that is that there have been many elections in which the Republican Party has not yet achieved 50% of the white vote in California. People don't seem to know this. They think it's entirely because of the immigrant vote, but it's because they didn't rally their base. Another example of a transformation, sexual transformation through immigration, is of course Virginia. Northern Virginia was a southern state, and it's now become something else. The northern part of West Virginia, of northern Virginia, is entirely populated by immigrants and civil servants, and they move the state decisively to the left. And that's why the current government is trying to force through, it's proposing gun control, and she's removed tax exemption from Confederate charities. In the land of Robert E. Lee, she's just removed tax exemption from Confederate charities. And she's, of course, trying to gerrymander the state. There's going to be an election about that, a referendum about that on Tuesday. She's the state which has voted like 45% for Trump. Under her plan, will only have one Republican district. The rest of the 10 districts are they're like very long strips stretching up to Northern Virginia, incorporating just enough Democrats in Northern Virginia to swamp the votes of rural Virginians to the south. Now, I should say, this is kind of a tangent. People say a week is a long time in politics, but 50 years can be a blink of an eye. We saw Roe versus Wade overturned a little while ago, after 50 years or so, in which it was considered to be settled law. Roe versus Wade, the abortion ruling, regardless of what you think about abortion, it was clearly wrongly decided as a matter of law. They just made up the law to pass it. Another example is Brown versus Board of Education, which imposed segregation, integration right across the country. Again, completely absurd legal reasoning, regardless of what you think the merits of the policy were. But one example which you've probably not heard of is Reynolds versus Sims, which was one of the last of Earl Warren's, of the Earl Warren Court's rulings. What that did was, it forced the states to apportion both their legislative districts on the basis of population. So it had been the case that many states had state senates, which, like the US Senate, are not based on population per se, but as an attempt to give representation to the several different communities that exist within the state. So, for example, typically the rural areas, for example, of a state like Illinois, would have more senators than would be indicated by purely on the basis of population, because otherwise the rural areas were simply outvoted by Chicago, by the big city of Chicago. Reynolds versus Sims is justified on the grounds of one man, one vote. But that's not the sole issue in democracy. The issue is what constitutes a community, and should that community be outvoted by the majority, subject to tyranny of the majority. So the result of this decision is that many states now are completely dominated by the big cities, which of course are increasingly, which are overwhelmingly non-white, increasingly immigrant descended. Chicago is a classic example. I think something like 70% of the population of Illinois lives in Chicago, but Illinois is 400 miles long, And if you go south of Illinois, and Lydia's parents lived in, grandparents at one point lived in, on her Union side, lived in Bradford, Illinois, which is 3 hours south and west of Chicago. It's a completely different world, absolutely different world than Chicago. But they have no control over their local affairs. It's true to a certain extent in Michigan. I mean, Michigan is obviously seriously dominated, not as much dominated, but by Detroit. And it's true in Maryland, which is completely dominated by Baltimore, and it's true in New York State, it's a major problem. And what it means is that the only answer to being ruled by an essentially foreign community is secession. And that's why you see state secession movements springing up. For example, in the Greater Idaho movement, which seeks to remove eastern Oregon from the rule of Seattle. In Illinois itself, there are several different movements to partition Illinois and transfer parts of it to Indiana and to Wisconsin and so on. And that's happened because there's no other way to get representation apart from secession. And that's a theme that's steadily rising in American politics. So, and then finally in this section, we're going to talk about what Trump has done. There has been an absolutely dramatic change in the GOP, in general, in immigration debate, and particularly the GOP. When I got started on this debate, the conventional wisdom among conservative Republicans is that immigration is okay, we don't need to worry about it. That's completely gone now. Tom Tancredo, who was a congressman from Colorado, another state that's been debauched by immigration, once told me that there was a meeting, when he was in Congress, there was a sort of affinity group meeting of Republican congressmen, and they made the mistake of making him the chair of it briefly. And so he showed a video of the situation at the southern border, which is quite completely chaotic. People zerg rushing the border patrol and sneaking across at night and all this kind of thing. And he said the response from the Republican members was, they all got up and walked out. And by the time the movie was over, there was nobody in the room except him and one or two of his friends. Because they just simply didn't want to think about this. It upset the donors, and it meant they might be called racists, and the leadership didn't like it, and they just wouldn't want to think about it. Well, now, of course, they are thinking about it. And we see, for example, there's a Cuban Republican congressman who's trying to get an amnesty bill through at the moment, and she's been fiercely attacked by other Republicans, Brandon Gill and so on, from Texas, and they make exactly these arguments that this is going to elect new people. As a policy matter, secondly, Trump has produced a really dramatic turnaround, and there's essentially no border crossings now, and they run at a rate of millions a year. But less noted than that, he's also dramatically reduced legal immigration by about half. And some key parts of this, like asylum seekers and refugees, have been reduced by a factor of 90%. The problem is that this has entirely been done by executive action. It can be reversed as it was after he went out of office in 2020 by Biden. But I should say one other great thing he's done is he's brought birthright citizenship into public debate. And he's done it by, birthright citizenship is the most peculiar interpretation of the law. It's not in the Constitution, it was done by judicial decree, that the child of any illegal alien born in the US, or even a tourist born in the US, is a US citizen and entitled to all kinds of benefits and so on. And as a practical matter, the parents, it's very difficult to deport the parents if they have a citizen child. It could be done. It could be reformed by statute. They could simply pass a bill saying what they meant, what the Constitution means by subject to jurisdiction thereof, which is in the Constitution. Alternatively, they could pass a constitutional amendment, which is not easy, but at least would force the Democrats to vote up or down on this, and then run in elections on it. Now, what we've been writing about this at for 25 years. We first wrote about it in 2020, but now it's gotten into public debate. What he's done is he's tried to do it through executive action. He's just announced that the executive branch is unilaterally going to reinterpret what birthright citizenship means. I must admit that had never occurred to me as a possibility that could be done. But that is what the Supreme Court is currently ruling on. It's not directly ruling on whether birthright citizenship is in the Constitution. It's ruling on whether or not you can do these things by executive action. But whatever they rule, it's incumbent on the Republican Congress to immediately move legislation on birthright citizenship. I mean, the income tax was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and the result of that was a constitutional amendment had passed, and it was passed, and that's how we have income tax. So that's the way in which they should deal with birthright citizenship. This idea that the Supreme Court is like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with tablets that he's discovered with how all these rules on them, and there's nothing to be said about it. But any Supreme Court ruling is the law of the land. It's completely wrong. It's not the way law is supposed to work. Congress, the legislative branch, is supposed to change the law. Anyway, what is disappointing about Trump's action is that he blinked on the question on this Minneapolis situation. It's only the blue states where they're not cooperating with the law, where they have to do these mass deportations. And I thought the thing was developing very, very well. It forced people like Tim Walz and Mayor Frey in Minneapolis to make the most extravagant statements about how they're going to defy federal law. They were actually having insurrection. So I thought that the obvious thing to do was follow through and invoke the Insurrection Act and jail Governor Walz, and if necessary, push him forward to the point where you have a Kent State situation where there's so many riots attack law enforcement that there's a serious shooting outbreak. I remember Kent State, and it's quite contrary to the way you think it went. What happened was anti-war demonstrations on the campus immediately stopped, and Nixon won the 72 election overwhelmingly. So that's what I assumed that they were going to do. And the peak of that thinking, which I think is what some of his aides did want to do, was the State of the Union address, where he actually said everybody's stand was in favour of illegal immigrants being deported, and none of the Democrats stood, except Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania. I mean, that's a great thing to run on, and that's going to make a great Republican campaign if they choose to run on it. But he didn't choose to run it. He's apparently decided to attack Iran instead, which is a very big bore. Still, I have to say there are what he's done is not completely reversible, because he's done immense damages to these refugee NGOs, these refugee organisations like Catholic Charities and so on. They have to lay masses of people off. They can't reconstruct their treasonous illegal immigrant settling activities for quite some time after Trump's out of office, even if he's not succeeded by another immigration patriot. Of course, the biggest single failure is that he has not got behind the idea of an immigration moratorium. That is to say, no net immigration, which is needed. How long is it since 1967? It's what, 60 years. We need an immigration moratorium for at least 60 years. No net immigration. That means that the immigration flow will be gross immigration to about 300,000 people leave the US every year. So you could have 300,000 coming in without any, now take care of any hardship cases and needed skills and so on. Ironically, it's quite close to the number that Teddy Kennedy claimed would continue in 1965. So, in conclusion, I'm going to go to what happens now. My third section, what now? What is going to happen now? Well, am I running over, by the way?
We're good.
Okay.
We're always good.
Okay, well, the short answer is I don't know what's going to happen now. The first possibility is that this alien nation will actually become more alien, and we'll see sectional breakup. Boundaries, I think, could be redrawn right across North America. The Canadians have messed themselves up as well, and with the result that the West, and in particular Alberta, are talking about seceding and possibly forming a relationship with the US. You see, so you could see boundaries drawn across North America, putting compatible communities together. And people always say this is impossible. But what people don't realise is that actually the US is already in a state of secession. Some states have already practically seceded from the Union. I said earlier that the red states, for example Minnesota, openly saying they're not going to enforce federal immigration law. I mean, how much more insurrectionary can you get? But the even more serious problem is that it turns out that the Trump administration cannot enforce the law anywhere in blue states easily. Because both the blue state judges and the prosecutors you can only appoint them with the consent of the Senate in general, but particularly there's this thing called the blue slip arrangement, whereby senators from each state can veto people they don't like. And what that means is that the prosecutors and the judges in the blue states are partisan Liberal Democrats. And that's why you see Antifa prosecuting Texas and not in Seattle. And similarly, it's proved that jury nullification has become a very, very serious problem. The juries simply not just ignoring the law, both the grand juries and the juries. For example, Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, who I mentioned earlier, is quite clearly engaged in serial mortgage fraud going back 40 years. It was exposed by a very interesting forensic accountant called Sam Antar, who is particularly qualified in this area because he served some years in federal jail for being engaged in the Crazy Eddie fraud. Does anybody remember Crazy Eddie? It was a huge discount store in New York State, had famous advertisements. Crazy Eddie, his prices were insane. The reason they're insane is they weren't paying taxes of any kind. Anyway, it's a bit like the movie Catch Me If You Can. He flipped sides and became a forensic accountant. And he's been able to show that she's engaged in serial mortgage fraud in many different cases. But the Trump administration so far is unable to get an indictment because grand juries in blue jurisdictions like D.C. and the Eastern District of Virginia, which is dominated by Northern Virginia, will not indict a Democrat official. And prosecutors in these areas are also Democrats, and they won't generally prosecute them. And on the occasions when you've got special prosecutors in to do it, the courts say they haven't been legally appointed because the Senate is not approving the appointment of Trump's prosecutors. The situation is completely paralysed. So these states are already in a state of secession. Now, the second possibility I see in America is somewhat similar to the South African situation. In South Africa, whatever else is going on in South Africa, there was a coherent nation there, the Afrikaners, the Dutch-speaking whites, who've been there, as long as since the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts, and they developed a community there and a state, and it's had, of course, all kinds of other people in it, which was an awkward problem for them. But they did control this state, and then they were induced to abandon it. They never mounted a really serious opposition to that. They were just gradually suborned into abandoning the state, with the result that South Africa is now falling apart. I have theories as to why this happened. One of them is just sheer bribery. I think the mining companies bribed the Afrikaner leadership. But another reason is just ideological hegemony. They weren't able to formulate their ideas that would have defended themselves. Now, that's the nightmare scenario here. That white America, which is to say America, will not be able to stop what's being done to it. It won't be able to develop a leadership and before it's too late. What was going on in the Biden administration was a communist coup. It was it was fascist in form, but communist in content. What I mean by fascist in form is that they often work through private corporations. For example, if you go and look at the Vida website, which is still up, it's still maintained. Its archives are all still there. You'll see a discussion from Lydia and a video presentation. I think we had more than 50 private entities cancel us for no reason, just purely for political reasons. Not just the internals, but also, for example, bulk email tools just suddenly upped and cancelled us. One of them, Constant Contact, which is the industry leader, when she found we could no longer send stuff out, she called them and said, excuse me, my voice is wearing out. She called them and said, what's going on here? They said, the girl says, oh, we no longer service your industry. What industry is that? She said, just a moment, she looked up, oh, it's white supremacy. That's the reason we've been cancelled. It's a long, long list, and it goes to payment processes as well, which was really crippling. And it was being done, as it turns out, by pressure from the federal government. They were pressuring these banks and so on not to work with people they didn't like. Most notably, gun dealerships. But we're worse than gun dealerships, we were told by one bank. We're more evil than gun dealerships. It's communist in content because it's not nationalist. It's not a nationalist movement. It's an egalitarian movement, and it's basically a racial socialist movement, transferring wealth from the using state power to transfer wealth to favoured races. And it's resulting in a cold civil war. And one of the big problems with a divided community like this is, justice systems don't work across racial lines. And one of the other problems, which is actually contributing seriously to the heat level in American politics, is that the two parties no longer represent. There's a whole bipolar distribution in who votes for which party. The Democrats have not carried the white vote in America since 1964. Their party is a coalition of people of colour, of homosexuals and Jews, with a minority of whites. I've seen reports that in the 2024 election, incredibly, 14% of the Democrat vote was made up of homosexuals. I find that hard to believe, but we were going through a moment there during the transgender craze, when the numbers of Americans who had identified as homosexual had ticked up very sharply. So it was getting to like 5 and 6% rather than 1 or 2%, which has been for years. Now, of course, as we all know, gays are everywhere, and there are plenty of gays in the immigration patriot movement. But it is true that the tone of the Democratic Party is set by these groups. And there's technical literature on this subject, and these groups are significantly more prone to emotional disorders than what normal white-bread whites are. And it's significantly more emotional. And I think that's something that we see in American politics quite a lot. And it also raises the stakes in elections, because it means that there's these parties essentially represent two nations. They're two separate nations in the bosom of one state. So the third possibility is that it will all go away. I'm fond of saying that miracles happen quite often in politics. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. Nobody remembers the Cold War unless you have to be at least over 40, I guess now. Who remembers the Cold War? No, I see. It was extremely serious. And after the fall of Vietnam, it was the universal assumption, the conservative movement, that the US was done for. I remember I went to see Bill Rusher in 1975. Bill Rusher was the publisher of National Review, and actually I think a much more important figure than Buckley. And he said to me, when he realised I was a friend, I was interviewing him for the Canadian Financial Post. When he realised I was a friend, we went off the record, and he said to me, confidentially, all is lost. Vietnam had just fallen, Angola and Mozambique had just fallen, the Soviets had built a blue water navy, They were operating in every ocean in the world. He said the last chance was in '76 when we tried to nominate Reagan. Now the red flag will wave over the world. This was one of the leaders of the Conservative movement. But he said we persevere because, on the one hand, you never know what's going to happen next. And that's a principle in Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist. There's a whole section where he discusses why you don't surrender, because you don't know what's going on over the hill. The other side being maybe in even more trouble than you are. And the second reason, he said, is the theological injunctions against despair. He was a very serious Anglo-Catholic. And I'm sure that there are theological injunctions against despair. Anyway, it's all turned around in 5 years. 1980, Reagan was elected, and he proceeded to win the Cold War, which was a real thing. Things just got better. So I'm going to conclude one of my favourite quotes, which I've not used for a long time, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident. He said, this was his Nobel Prize speech, which was in the early 70s, he had been as a youth a communist, and in the Soviet Union they had this theory. They were trying to do. They had this theory that they'd abolish nationalities. It was wrong to. They invented what they call a Soviet man, who was entirely cultural and ideological construct. Very similar to the neoconservative theory of America, that they've developed a universal nation, which has gotten away from, that was the title of Ben Wattenberg's book, that's gotten away from its ethnic roots. Anyway, but Solzhenitsyn didn't believe, this is why what Solzhenitsyn says here is so radical. He said, in recent times, it has become fashionable to talk about the levelling out of nations and the disappearance of individual peoples in the melting pot, of modern civilization. I do not agree with this, but must leave discussion of it for another occasion. Here, I would only say that the disappearance of nations would impoverish us no less than if all men were to become alike with the same character and the same human face, the same face. Nations are the wealth of mankind, its generalized personalities. The very smallest of them wears its own special colours and bears within itself a special facet of God's design. Unquote. Well, I think that the US, as it had, when I saw it, and I came here in 1970, was a special facet of God's design. And I think we should keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Don't go away. You there in the black jacket.